Hello, historians, and welcome to the History of the Everyday. This week's edition, phones. Think you know all there is to know about phones? We shall see. So, history of the telephone. I'm sure you all think you know the story of Alexander Graham Bell, who invented the phone, therefore case closed. The first successful bidirectional transmission of clear speech by Bell and Watson was made on March 10th, 1876, when Bell spoke into the device, "Mr. Watson, come here, I want to see you," and Watson complied with this request. On the 14th of January, 1878, Alexander Graham Bell demonstrated his newly invented device, the telephone, to none other than Queen Victoria. So, if you were not familiar with that story, now you clearly are. So that's the history of the telephone. Alexander Graham Bell invented the telephone in 1876. End of video. That didn't take very long at all. Actually, as with most things in the world, and especially in history, it's actually more complicated than it may first seem. So, let's do the deep dive, shall we? It actually goes back much, much longer than you may think. So there are examples of distance communication. So for example, the use of fires or beacons or smoke signals, prehistoric times. The first invention or recorded use of mail was in the 6th century BC, so quite some time ago. The first recorded use of birds or pigeons for sending messages between cities was in the 5th century BC. Heliographs, 490 BC. What is a heliograph, I hear you ask, or I imagine you're asking. This is the idea that you use a mirror to reflect sunlight to send particular signals, 1 flash, 2 flash, 3 flash, etc. So that goes all the way back to 490 BC. So this is the idea of communicating over distances. So not exactly what you might expect for telephones. I'll give you that because they don't actually broadcast sound. So in terms of audio signals, well, technically that was also done with drums and horns. The idea of using drums, trumpets, for example, in battle was to signal when it was time to attack. But before the actual invention of the electric telephone, there were other mechanical devices used for transmitting communication. For example, the classic 2 cans and a piece of string. Now, it's a little bit more complicated than that, but this was part of the experiments done by British physicist Robert Hooke between 1664 and 1685, where he actually had been able to discover ways to transmit sound over much wider distances. And in fact, he created a practical use of the acoustic string telephone as early as 1667. Now you can imagine how groundbreaking that would have been for someone to be speaking on one side of the room and someone far too far away to hear them, all of a sudden hears that person's voice coming out the other side of a can. That would have been groundbreaking at the time. But it gets even more interesting than that. So, for example, there was this invention known as a speaking tube, where you would speak into one pipe or one particular tube, and the sound would travel down that tube and come out the other side. This was first suggested as a practical widespread invention in 1672 by none other than Sir Francis Bacon. And other experiments continued. For example, the French monk in 1782 decided that he would send a proposal to the Académie des Sciences, I assume my French pronunciation was perfect, of how to use this technology or these ideas in a widespread way. The British intellectual Jeremy Bentham first proposed the inclusion of conversation tubes in his architecture in various designs, in particular of prisons. His idea was that you could use this sort of communication technology to stop people having to walk back and forth from their guard stations. You could communicate who is and isn't allowed out of their cell at a certain time. It was an idea of making prisons more efficient, believe it or not. It was then proposed for the use in military, and in fact was instituted widespread throughout the Navy to communicate from the deck to down below. But the most common use of it, especially in the 1800s, was in sort of wealthier homes, which if you've ever walked around, for example, in London, you'll see there are a lot of garden flats or basement flats. Traditionally, these used to be servants' quarters. So you wouldn't want to go down and talk to the people making your food or the people who did your cleaning. So instead, you talk into a hole in the wall, and that would lead to a pipe that went down to them and barked orders at them. So it was a way of speaking from room to room. In fact, in 1849, in an old journal of the Scientific American magazine, described an experiment using this particular speaking tube or pipe technology that apparently went as far as 60 miles away, which is very impressive considering the first telephones couldn't go more than 3 miles. But eventually we get to this: electric and technology coming involved. So it goes like this. In 1838, we get this invention, the electric telegraph. Now, this is not about the history of the telegraph, obviously. This is about the history of the telephone. But the telegraph was the first time that using electricity and signals, they were able to transport sound across this wire technology. Now, generally it goes like this. 1838, you get the electric telegraph, you get heaps and heaps of experiments, and then all of a sudden in 1876, you get the telephone. Problem solved, right? Well, maybe not quite that simple. There is much to discuss, because supposedly this gentleman, before the actual telephone as we know it by Alexander Graham Bell was invented, there was a gentleman by the name of Johann Philipp Reis, or Philip Rice, and he invented something called the Rice telephone. So in 1861, he succeeded in making a device that captured sound, converted it into an electric signal, and transmitted it to another device. And he called this device a telephone, hence telephone. And there was a monument made to him in 1878 when European scientists declared that he had definitely invented the telephone. Case closed. But wait, there is, of course, more. Because this gentleman here, a Frenchman by the name of Charles Bousseau, had conceived a plan for conveying sounds and, in fact, even speech by electricity as early as 1854. So I guess he must be the inventor of the telephone. But it gets even more complicated than that, because a book published by an author by the name of Seth Shulman claims to provide definitive evidence that Alexander Graham Bell actually stole the ideas for the telephone from his rival, Elisha Gray. It is the title of the book, if you want to read it or if you want to research that, it's actually quite an interesting read, is The Telephone Gambit, Chasing Alexander Graham Bell's Secret. There is also evidence in that same book to suggest that an Italian immigrant to America named Antonio Meucci invented the telephone. So it's actually one of the most hotly contested issues in scientific and patent history. There was actually a major court case as recently as 2002 claiming that royalties were owed because of the use of designs by that particular family ancestor that were used to create the modern telephone as we know it. So I told you it was tricky. What we can say definitively is that there is definitely a series of experiments and attempts with sound waves and wires and technology that informed the next experiments. They all built off each other. If you are familiar with the phrase standing on the shoulders of giants, if not, here it is. Isaac Newton, one of the more famous scientists of the Enlightenment era, had this quote: "If I have seen further, it is by standing on the shoulders of giants." So what he is saying with this particular metaphor is that he has not done the majority of the work. So if you can imagine in the diagram, standing on the shoulder of the giant is lifting you most in the air, and you are getting a little bit taller, but you have not done as much as those who came before you. So this is the idea in history, and especially the idea in science. All science is built on previous science, okay? Now, in terms of the actual invention of the telephone, I just thought I should point this out. It wasn't necessarily received very well. Some predictions were made about the telephone. So, for example, this man, Sir William Preece, who was the chief engineer of British Post Office in 1878, had this to say about the telephone. The Americans have need of the telephone, but we do not. We have plenty of messenger boys. So he saw the telephone as a backup. If you don't have enough messenger boys, you need the telephone. But don't worry, we've got plenty in England, so it's fine. That was the way it was received in Great Britain. But also in America, this telephone has too many shortcomings to be seriously considered as a means of communication. The device is inherently of no value to us. This is from an internal memo at Western Union, which was the biggest communications company in America at the time. So they were involved in sending mail, but also involved with a lot of telegraph wires and communication. So if the telephone was adopted and they were to invest early, they would probably stand to make the most money out of it. But they didn't really see it as a particularly good invention. In fact, the memo goes on to say, the idea is idiotic on the face of it. Furthermore, why would any person want to use this ungainly and impractical device when he can send a messenger to the telegraph office and have a clear message sent to any large city in the United States? Yes, why would anyone want to speak directly to the person with which they communicate when they can talk to someone to take a message to someone else who then can type it out in Morse code over wires to be interpreted by someone else on the other end as a code, who has to then write that down as a telegram, give it to someone else, and then send that out via the post. Why on earth would anyone use a telephone when you've got that option available? Sometimes imagining the future is one of the toughest jobs there is. Now, in terms of some significant dates in development of the telephone, in 1877, the very first permanent outdoor telephone wire is completed. It stretches a distance of just 3 miles. So remember, I talked about the speaking tube that went for 60 miles, which was 1849. In 1877, the first telephone actually only goes for 3 miles. 1879, there had been enough people that had bought and subscribed to the telephone system that they could no longer just use their names. They had to start using phone numbers. So phone numbers get invented in 1879. In 1891, the first automatic dialing system was invented by a Kansas City undertaker. What that means is you do not need to speak to a person on the other end and say, operator, can you please connect me to? You can actually dial the number for yourself. Now, the reason he invented this was he thought that crooked operators were sending his potential customers elsewhere. It was his aim to get rid of the operators altogether. So I suppose in that sense, he succeeded, because very rarely do we call the operator to say, can you connect me to? But yeah, he was pretty paranoid. In 1900, the first coin-operated or payphone is installed in Hartford, Connecticut, which is a pretty big deal, because if it hadn't been for those, Superman may not have had anywhere to change in America. In 1918, about 10 million telephones are in service in the United States. So to put that in perspective, the population of the United States in 1918 was roughly around 120 million. So this is less than 1 in 10 people that have access to a telephone. And it's been nearly 50 years at this point. So in fact, 52 years at this point, since the invention of the conventional telephone. So it's coming up slowly. In 1927, that is when they first were able to make phone calls between London and New York, which was kind of a big deal. In 1946, technically, the first ever mobile phone was put into operation, because it was able to link communication between vehicles using radio waves. That particular technology would take a long time to develop. In 1955, they started laying transatlantic telephone cables all around the world. So these are planted deep in the Earth's oceans. And in fact, there are still cables all throughout Earth's oceans. And that is actually where the majority of the internet and data is transferred, not through satellites, despite the fact that in 1962, the world's first international communications satellite was launched. So that's relatively recently, going by human history standards. In 1973, the first handheld mobile phone is demonstrated by the company Motorola, and it weighed 2 kilograms, which is pretty heavy. But in 1983, they released their first widespread commercially available mobile phone. It was 2,300 pounds when it was first released, and its battery would last 30 minutes. So if you were, for example, a businessman or something like that, and you said, I need to be contacted between home and the office, so you've got your home number, your office number, and you'd have your mobile number, you would only be able to be contacted for the half hour it took you to get from place to place, and then hopefully you plug your phone straight in and charge it up again. Now, in terms of some particularly important things, in 1996, Nokia releases the 8810, also known as the Matrix phone. It was incredibly futuristic when it first came out. But it wasn't until 2001 that the majority of people in the UK, 62%, the previous year had been 47%, so less than the majority, actually owned a mobile phone. So it wasn't that common in 2001, and especially in 1996, that people would have a mobile. In fact, it was in 2001 that myself, Mr. Roberts, got my first mobile phone, a 8210 brick, and it had 2 numbers in it. One of them was my mum, the other one was my job. In 2007, Apple had launched the first iPhone, and this brings in the age of the smartphone, which pretty much changes everything with mobile phones. By 2008, it had actually only sold, it had sold 4.7 million in 3 months, and it had 13% of the market. So this is similar to what we saw the previous decade. In 2001, was the first time when the majority of people had a phone. By 2008, even though the iPhone's been out for a year, most people don't have it. It wasn't until 2011, for example, that smartphones are outselling computers. So people are buying more smartphones than computers. This is when smartphones and iPhones begin to really dominate the market. Coincidentally, also when I got my first smartphone. Okay. 2013 was the first time that survey showed that most people only had a mobile number and not necessarily a landline as well. Now, this particular image is the Matrix phone. You can see why it looked so futuristic at the time. You couldn't see the numbers, you couldn't see the keypad until you flipped it out. Oh my God, how futuristic. This was my first phone, the brick. You could drop it on the ground, throw it at the ground, and it would not break, unlike today's smartphones. And this is the first iPhone. So when it came out, its first model was $499 for 4 gigs and $599 for 8 gigs. It came with a stylus as well, and it didn't necessarily have all the features you would expect today, but it could connect to the internet, and it did have a primitive version of YouTube. But Wi-Fi was not necessarily that great in 2007, so even that didn't work so well. But some fun facts. I thought it was interesting to note that the very first text message ever was sent on 3rd of December 1992 between a 22-year-old engineer named Neil, who sent Merry Christmas via the Vodafone network to the phone of Richard Jarvis. I think it is worth noting that that is far too early to be sending Merry Christmas on the 3rd of December. Come on. That is way too early. In the 1990s, a gentleman by the name of Cliff Kushler invented T9, or text on 9 keys. If you are aware, or if you can see on the image there, the keys would have letters assigned to them. Now, you could send text messages by typing them out with the numbers, but if you wanted the letter C, which is the 3rd letter on 2, you had to press 2 3 different times for it to bring up C. So if you were writing the word cat, for example, you would press 222 to get a C, wait a moment for it to reset, press 2 again to get an A, and then you would go down and press the number 8. So you have just pressed, 6 buttons in order to write the word cat. So it was quite time consuming. Full keyboards on mobile phones were first introduced in 1997. And 2007 was also, just by coincidence, not just the first year that the iPhone was launched, but the first time that more text messages were sent and received in a month than calls. I think we can all agree that when your phone rings, you immediately become suspicious. Why isn't this person just messaging me? Now, in terms of these particular outcomes from the mobile phone, you will hear the older generation saying today, oh, kids are spending way too much time on their phones. I can tell you I was guilty of this from 99 to 2002. I was very much playing this amazing Nokia game of Snake, which just was the height of technology at the time. But also we would spend a lot of time on our phones because of that T9 text speak, and it would take a long, long time to send a text message. This is how I feel when I explain what it's like to be living in a world without a mobile phone, or in particular, a world without a smartphone. When I say things like, we had to go meet our friends, and if you were meeting your friends now, you text them, where are you? Oh, I'm by the thing. I'll be there in 5 minutes. You can find them. If you were going to meet your friends, you'd have to say, I will meet you in front of this exact building at this exact time. And you would wait maybe 2 or 3 minutes, 5 minutes, maybe 10 minutes. If they weren't there, that's it. You're not meeting them. Social engagement over, which is amazing to think that people used to have to actually be on time. And again, this is me sounding like an older person. This is, to me, where we are at now in reality. This was a cartoon from the New Yorker magazine. Keeps me from looking at my phone every 2 seconds. The fact of the matter is, adults just as guilty of being responsive to their phone as younger people. So phones are definitely here to stay, and we are so reliant on them now because they do so much for us. You can do your banking, you can do your internet searching, you can do your socializing, you can do your social media, all of these things that we are reliant on this technology by now. Now, one of the arguments you always hear is people spend too much time on their phone, and maybe you've seen these before. All of this technology is making us antisocial. That argument has existed for a very, very long time. To conclude, I will simply say, if you can remember, the first instinct of those in charge when the telephone was invented was to say that it was useless, to say it was terrible, to say no one would ever need it, no one would ever use it. That is actually the first instinct of, shall we say, a certain generation of society. Whenever a new technology comes out, they don't know it, they don't understand it, and they can't imagine a practical use for it. And yet, within a generation, or even faster, as it would seem with the smartphone, it is ubiquitous, which means it is everywhere and it is relied upon. So I hope we have come to consider the invention of the telephone as far more complicated than you thought. It is not a simple answer of Alexander Graham Bell. There was much work and research and experimentation before that took place. And in fact, it was not even guaranteed that his invention would be taken up by those in charge. Fortunately for us, it was. I assume that you have now rethought about the amazing history of the telephone. And in actual fact, you realize how much society depends on it now. What I find quite fascinating is, of all the countries in the world that have taken up mobile phone technology, it is actually the countries in Africa, in particular countries such as Kenya and Nigeria, that lead the world in the speed of mobile take-up technology. People had mobile phone technology in those countries before they had landline phones, for example. Why would you bother installing a landline when you can just jump straight to mobile phones? More internet banking is done on the continent of Africa than anywhere else, which is pretty amazing. It is giving technology, it is giving speed, it is giving processing power to all sorts of places around the world. Now, the shape of the next century will probably be dependent on the mobile phone, the same way the shape of the last century, the 20th century, was reliant on the telephone. I, for one, am very excited to see where it goes. So, I hope you have enjoyed this particular edition, and I will see you next time on the History of the Everyday.